Okay, good morning. This is a, a video. Sorry, can't talk right now. So this will be a new uh, video of my autobiography. Kind of forgot that the one that's up isn't accessible, so I apologize for that if you're trying to access it. Thank Aaron for letting me know. And I don't have any notes. I'm just going to talk about this. And I thought I had notes from the last one, but I can't find them. So probably didn't. Probably did the same thing. So, and as the instructions on the syllabus state, this is my autobiography in relationship to my experiences with diversity. Okay. I was born December 3rd, 1952. That makes me 68 years old. I was born actually in Rapid City, South Dakota, because my father was in the Air Force during the Korean War. And he was stationed up at that Air Force base, which I've visited a few years ago with my mom. So I have obviously, I have no memories. We left a year later, I think. His tour duty was up, and we came back to New Orleans. Well, we came back to Lafayette. My dad went to college, which was not his plan when he left Rapid City. We drove back, spent the night with my mom's sister and her husband. Her husband, his name Peter Touye, was Peter Touye. Both have since passed. And he was a math instructor at UL, then called SLI. That's when their mascots were the Bulldogs, one of my earliest stuffed animals. I have no idea where it is today. I'm sure it was thrown away. And he convinced my father to register for college. Within 24 hours, my dad there was veterans housing on campus, and he began his studies in electrical engineering. He was an electrician in the Air Force, and had an electrical job waiting for him in New Orleans. So, and he is the first person in his family to go to college. He's the only person of his generation that went to college, which doesn't mean that any of his brothers weren't very educated, and sisters weren't very educated, because they were very well read over time. So, and my dad was the youngest son, second youngest child. All of his brothers served in the Second World War. His oldest brother was a merchant marine. So anyway, had at least 3 ships torpedoed out from under him and survived all those. Anyway, I'm digressing, which I tend to do. So by going to college, it changed the quality of his life, and then changed the trajectory probably of my life. um, in my brothers. But anyway, so we arrived in New Orleans in probably at some point around 56, 57. And probably 56. He completed his degree in 3.5 years while working part-time jobs. And in birthing another son and another on the way, I think, when we arrived in New Orleans. So it shows you what commitment and focus can do. Anyway, so basically where I'm getting at is I grew up in the segregated South. My memories and experience of that are quite vivid. And really begins with a memory of a bus trip down to Canal Street with my grandmother. We walked, we got onto the bus. I was probably 5-ish, and 5 will be the general number. I don't think I would have been much younger than that. I don't think it was 6. Because I actually started kindergarten at 5, which was a little early. Because I was a December baby. Anyway, I remember when we got on the bus was virtually empty, except in the back, where it was quite crowded with African Americans. I don't remember if there was a bar across the seat. Likely was. It's a bar that bus drivers would move, depending on how much the bus filled up. And I asked my grandmother at that time, why are all those people sitting in the back or sitting back there or something to that effect? And her response to me was, shh, that's not something we talk about. So it's okay. I've thought a lot about that over the years, knowing who my grandmother was, knowing her background, and knowing who my grandfather was and his background. And it wasn't so much that it was an uncomfortable thing to talk about, I don't think. But I think it was because that they did not agree with it. But publicly, you just didn't talk about things like that. But it was clear over time, and even now through my adult life, knowing things about, that's my mother's family, my mother's grandmother. They were quite intimate with African Americans. They were around the house all the time, usually for work of some type, which clearly, I believe they saw that as a responsibility to provide people with work. My grandmother did have an African-American maid. The experience was not one from the help. More often than not, they worked together, doing the household chores. She was there to help, not to do alone. And anytime there was an event, she was there. She was serving and clearly being paid for that time. Her husband and sons were often there and working with my grandfather. It was a unique property in New Orleans, near the corner of Carrollton, Claiborne and Napoleon. And there was a big key lot. So there was an open lot surrounded by houses that faced the street on 4 different streets. 2 giant fig trees, which we often climbed and picked, and a large truck garden that my grandfather worked. It's how he supported his family during the war, largely. Mom has stories about the rabbit cages in the back, and that was their primary source of meat, was rabbit that they raised. Anyway, but that was my, looking back, clearly that was my first introduction to segregation. The second one is a few years later. I'm probably about 8 years old. We had moved out to Jefferson Parish, area today called River Ridge, then called Little Farms. One of those cracker box houses, 700 square feet, first house. All this part of although it's a little bit later, but post-war building. And I was standing, we actually, most of the neighborhood children were young men or boys. There was an older group. Probably at that point, they were in, 13, 14 years of age. So a bit older than and most of us were in my age group. So there were probably about 6 or 7 boys standing on the street, just hanging out, talking, whatever we were doing. And this young black man was walking down the street. He had you had along basically the river, you had say the white community, and then across the tracks was the black community, Bunch Village. And he was walking from Jefferson Highway, where he'd gotten off the bus, back to Bunch Village. And the young man passed us and was maybe 20, 30 yards up the street. No incident. And then the oldest boy, whose father happened to be a state trooper, grabbed, I don't know if it was a rock or a stick at this point, and threw it at the young black man, saying, "I wish our ancestors or whatever hadn't brought them people over here." That was the most blatant act of racism I had yet been introduced to. It clearly has stuck with me. Because here was a young man minding his own business, just trying to get home, probably from a job. And obviously whatever was thrown didn't connect, but the young man took off, fear for safety. It really made my heart sink at that time. Now, that was probably that might have been 7, because that was probably in 59. We hadn't moved there very long. Oh, by the way, the state trooper was once, this may not have no meaning to you, society, but he had once dated Donna Douglas. Now, who's Donna Douglas? If you don't remember, she was the original Ellie Mae Clampett. Anyway, just a bit of trivial tidbit. So but the other side of that at the same time was I went to Catholic school from kindergarten all the way through high school. And the local Catholic school that I went to, I went to school with some African American students, and they actually lived about 4 blocks down the street. Nice house. They were both pharmacists. I guess they fell in love in pharmacy school. I can't remember if it was at Northwestern in Monroe or at Xavier in New Orleans, where the 2 pharmacy schools are, even back then. And they pretty much kept to themselves, as I remember. But they were present in the parish, in school, that type of thing. So before the public schools were integrated, my schools were integrated. And again, another aside. And I remember distinctly. So as I got a little older and began watching the news, I watched all the things that were happening in the South, dealing with civil rights. The dogs, the fire hoses, all the beatings, that were on the news. And it always disturbed me. Didn't understand. But that said, I continued to live a fairly segregated life. And that is just the reality of the times. The other incident, about the same time as the incident with the young man in the neighborhood, we were at JCPenney's shopping. And it was a time, so again, it was probably 59, maybe 60. Getting ready for school, I'm sure. We shopped a lot at JCPenney's in those days. It was clearly it was at Lakeside Shopping Center when it was first built. So whatever year that was. And there were, obviously segregated bathrooms and segregated drinking fountains. Well, I didn't understand what that was. I was thirsty. And I went and drank at the quote unquote colored drinking fountain. And I got whipped by my father, explaining to me this is not something that you do. Because I was just wanting to drink the water. So, he explained as best he could to a young boy the situation, but he clearly wanted me to understand that this was not something you did. You know, I'm sure within was not that much longer when all that disappeared, yeah, due to changes in the law. So those were my early experiences and understanding that we lived in a segregated community. Never thought about it much, but the African Americans that came to the churches, because there were a lot of Catholic African Americans in that area, always sat in the same place. It never dawned on me as a child why that was. It just gives you, I mean, that's my the beginnings of that story. I grew up in New Orleans. I'm very much a person of New Orleans through my life. I still identify to some degree with that. Went to high school, went to Catholic high school, and I started high school in what would be considered the kind of working class high school in New Orleans. St. Aloysius Jesuit was the upper class high school. We were big opponents of each other. So it was a mix. But here we begin to talk about ethnicities, and I'll talk more about this when I talk about the Banks article, and I have my notes. I'm not sure if I'll do that today. It's not due for, it doesn't have to be ready for a few more days. But everybody, I went to high school with a cross section of working class, what I would consider working class New Orleans. My father was an engineer, so he would not technically have been considered working class, but he was working class because that's how he grew up. My mother, her grandfather was an important doctor in New Orleans, founded the first psychiatric hospital in the state of Louisiana, was supposedly friends with Freud, according to family story. I don't know. The timelines don't seem to fit anyway. And he may have known of him. I don't know. Maybe they met at some point. I don't know. But Freud would have been much younger than my great grandfather. Anyway, who passed away, was it 1910? I can't remember, maybe a little bit earlier than that. I don't know if he got out of the 19th century. And all of my grandfather's brothers were engineers. He was not. He was a runaway. He would have been prescribed Ritalin or Adderall. That's where we all get our ADHD from. He not only ran away from home, he ran away from the boarding school they sent him to. He worked mostly in sales. He did hard labor. I mean, I worked at shipyards, I think. He had 2 different tours of duty with the service, one in the Navy and one in the Army. Both times he was a medic or corpsman, however you want to say that. My grandmother's family, but the family generally would have been considered professional middle class. They were My great-grandfather was originally from Connecticut by way of Cincinnati. And he came down to New Orleans um, to learn medicine prior to the Civil War, just prior to the Civil War, and then ended up getting drafted um, as a corpsman, I guess. Or they might have called them, nurses, whatever at that time. And was eventually captured and worked at the Union prisoner of war camp near the Great Lakes, near Chicago, and received commendations from both the North and the South for the number of people he cared for and saved medically through that period, which is not something I knew maybe until 20 years ago. About so anyway, um, that said, and my grandmother's family was I don't know if you would call them New Orleans aristocracy, um, but they lived in on Esplanade, and they were in the commercial field, banking or import export, those kinds of things. Most of my grandmothers or great grandmothers on both sides have some connection with the families that escaped the slave rebellion in Saint Domingue, today Haiti, and came to the New Orleans. So, some of that is, in a distant part of the, I guess you could say, the planter class. But really saw themselves as a kind of working class. And my father, he actually went to work for Schlumberger on the ground floor. Had he stayed with Schlumberger, who knows what our future would have been. We probably would have ended up in Houston at some point in the 60s, late 60s, maybe 70s. A life trajectory would have been different. But he quit because he was away from the family too much, offshore doing wildcatting and that kind of stuff. So looking for oil. So he took a much more low-paying job, but an important job because he would it would upset the fire rates for buildings across the state. And I've traveled across the state with him in the summers, particularly to some of these places. Very interesting job. He ended up on the fire marshal's board not long before his death, and he died early. So anyway, my dad died at 49 in 1978. I don't know, I'm rambling and I apologize for that. So, and those of you who are in 585 will find out I'm very much a child of the river. Never lived very far from the Mississippi River, so it'll be part of my play story for 585. So I guess where I started was the ethnicities of my classmates, which were all Italian and Irish, Croatian, from all parts of the city of New Orleans. I say Italian, I don't remember. And obviously French, German. So the kaleidoscope of ethnicities and African American, of course, various Latino or Hispanic, Cubans and Dominicans and Nicaraguans who had immigrated into the US And so that, and find interesting is everybody lived in the same neighborhoods. Everybody, I mean, when I say that, we lived in all parts of the city, but within those individual neighborhoods, you had a mixture of all those ethnicities and some degree races. So the and so we shared all these different values. We dated each other's. I had no sisters, but we dated each other's sisters or neighbors. We used each other to meet people. I dated Italians and French and German girls all through high school. Mostly Catholic schoolgirls, some public school. I mean, I wasn't picky. So anyway, of course, didn't find my true love until college. But anyway, but a lot of them married their high school sweethearts. We're still connected very much on Facebook today, across the board. So, and that's, you know, so that's kind of my story. Coming into today, you know, going to university after Navy. I didn't, when I finished high school, I really had no desire to go to college, basically because I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had no desire for anything, except probably my girlfriend at the time, which I joined the Navy hoping to find a trade. Put that off a few months because I was in love, quote unquote. I planned to learn a skill, ended up in naval intelligence. Said a lot. That informed my decisions later about coming to college. Obviously, majoring in Russian studies once I got to LSU. And that, of course, was an important change in the direction. Now, when I entered that rate in the Navy, I thought I knew I was going into communications. I don't think I knew exactly a lot about the intelligence side. I did know early on I had to get a top secret clearance, and I think that kind of informed me, informed me of where I was heading. So anyway, so it gives you a little bit of sense of who I am, particularly in my experiences in terms of race, but also my experiences in class. You know, in a lot of places, one of the first questions you ask someone is what does your daddy do, right? Well, in New Orleans, it's the same question, but it's what school do you go to? What high school you go to? What high school did you go to? And while not perfect, that informed. Because certain girls in certain boys' schools were considered at different levels of class. But interestingly, I dated girls from across the spectrum of most of the high schools. There are a few I never got to. So really didn't, including public schools. So really didn't, finally my senior year, I got my first really steady girlfriend, and which we kept that relationship through part of my time in the Navy. But that separation finally finished it, which is understandable, particularly from her point. She didn't want to wait around. Um, anyway, so I mean, the last thing I'll tell you is about me is I've been married for 41 years. I've known my wife 45 years. It's the first girl I really met at LSU. First girl I asked to dance at a freshman get-together dance. I wish you could say it was happily ever after, but obviously no relationship is like that. So, but we, 4 years later, we almost to the day that we met, we got, it just happenstance. It wasn't a conscious decision. We were married, and we've been married. So, and anyway, and that has pretty much been happily ever after. And clearly our love is deeper today than any point in our long tenure together. And so, that, I don't know if I've generated any questions on your part, which I'll be glad to answer if I can. That's kind of the autobiography in my experiences, and has colored my views of diversity. So thank you all very much. And I hope this helps you write your own, because that's the purpose of this. Thank you.